Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Patrick Hyman. I'm one of the OCAT team members. Very excited to welcome everyone to today's webinar titled Welcoming Newcomers, Working with Refugee and Immigrant Clients and Families. So I think as a lot of you understand and know, newcomers face a lot of unique challenges integrating into the United States. These challenges can include not only adapting to a new country, culture, and language, but also dealing with different work expectations, institutions, and probably environments as well. Refugees can additionally face other complications. Many have fled terror, violence, persecution, and family disruption in their home countries, often carrying traumatic life experiences with them to their new lives. In this webinar, our presenters will detail approaches that can be taken by caseworkers dealing specifically with refugee individuals and families, and more broadly, with immigrant clients. So this will include strategies for addressing vulnerable clients' basic needs when completing OCAT appraisals and follow-ups. Also encourage caseworkers to address language, gender, religion, and cultural issues in an appropriate and client-centered manner, while also, and this is important too, while also kind of appreciating the unique strengths and qualities that newcomers bring with them to the U.S. Next slide, please. So a quick note on logistics before we get started. We've scheduled some Q&A time after our speakers' presentations. Now, to ask a question, please type in your inquiry in the questions box on the lower right part of your screen. You'll see it. It'll say questions there. And you click on there and you can type in your question. And no need to wait until the end of the presentations to type in your questions. If there's something you want to ask, please enter the question as you think of it. And our speakers, depending on where they are, they may be able to address that question in real time. Next slide, please. Okay, before we begin today, we'd like to take a minute or so and have everyone listening fill out a couple of really quick polls. You can find the questions for this poll on the box in the left-handed side of your screen. If you click the word poll, which is in the dark gray box, it'll drop down and show 3 questions we'd like for you to answer. And this is kind of to help speakers and our staff get an idea of the makeup of the audience listening in today. So let's go ahead and go for that first poll if we can. Should pop up. There we go. Aha. Okay, so what best describes your position? Please select one of these options if you would. Okay, let's see what we got here. Blink. All right. So it looks like we have, interesting. We have almost 60% of you are case managers, approximately 18% are supervisors, 3% are administrators, and then a large number, 21% are in other. Maybe if we have time later, we can kind of explore that in a little more detail. Okay, great. Thanks, folks. Let's go to that second poll. Okay, trying to get into a little of folks' background working with the populations we'll be discussing today. So question is, have you worked with immigrant clients before? Yes, no, or not sure? Oh, lovely. So 95% of you have said yes, you have. 3% no, 3% not sure. All right, so folks are bringing a lot of experience with them to today's webinar. That's fantastic. There'll be lots of stuff folks can share, I'm sure. Okay, next poll, please. Okay, next and last question. Have you worked with refugee clients before? Yes, no, or not sure? Okay, a little different from our first question, but looks like around 82% said yes, they've worked with refugees. 13% no, and 5% not sure. So a few more folks, maybe a little less experience working with refugees than they have with immigrants. Okay, interesting. Great. Thanks so much. Next slide, please. Alrighty. So I'll stop talking soon, I promise, everyone. But before we kind of jump into our speakers, I wanted to highlight a little bit of their background. So we have two fantastic speakers today, Amy Watson and Jose Serrano. Amy is the Health and Gender Senior Program Manager at the International Rescue Committee, what some folks may know as the IRC. That's based, at least her office is based in Sacramento. And she oversees programs encompassing a number of things: health access, psychosocial support, gender equality, as well as intensive case management for refugees and immigrant survivors of crime. She also oversees the HOPE anti-trafficking program, and that program serves survivors of human trafficking and provides training and technical assistance throughout 30 Northern California counties. Our other speaker, Jose Serrano. Jose is a Department of Justice accredited representative with 10 years of experience working in all aspects of immigration law. As an advocate for vulnerable populations, Jose actively collaborates in refugee forums in both Orange and LA counties. He chairs the State Advisory Council on Refugee Assistance and Services, directs an art and mentorship program that involves refugee and immigrant kids, raises awareness about immigration, and works to build inclusive communities for new Americans in Southern California. Jose is also a refugee resettlement program manager with World Relief Southern California. And in the last 5 years, he has resettled over 600 refugees from different parts of the world, including Syria, Iraq, Iran, Uganda, Burma, Afghanistan, Armenia, and Russia. So obviously, two speakers with a lot of expertise and a lot of background in today's topic. Next slide, please. Sorry about that. Okay, so before we jump in here, I want to just talk really quick, high level about kind of what are the things we hope folks walk away from today's webinar. And again, you can thank me later. I won't read this slide verbatim. I think folks can do that themselves, but there's basically 5 or so goals or objectives that we have with this webinar. I think in a nutshell, the expectation, excuse me, the expectation is that attendees will walk away from this presentation with, I think, an improved understanding of immigrant refugee families in the U.S., as well as kind of how certain case management practices, and specifically we're talking about strength-based, trauma-informed care, and cultural competency approaches, how those strategies can assist you in your work with these populations, as well as we'll be kind of providing guidance for using OCAT with these groups, I think particularly when asking folks questions that are more sensitive in nature. So with that, we'll go next slide, and I'll turn it over to Jose and Amy.
Good morning, everyone. This is Jose. We are going to start off our presentation with looking at immigration terms or categories that define our immigrant populations. So given that about 95% of you have worked with refugees and immigrants, you might have already come across these different types of definitions or categories that are oftentimes used as synonyms when describing a refugee or a migrant. But the important part of this slide or presentation is that the terms do matter, especially when it comes to identifying a client or perhaps making sure that they're eligible for a certain service. For instance, an immigrant is one who comes to live permanently in a foreign country, or a refugee is a person who has been forced to leave their country in order to escape war, persecution, or natural disaster. A newcomer is a person who recently arrived. A migrant is a person that makes a home from place to place. And so oftentimes, as I mentioned before, these terms are used synonymously. But the reality is that they do matter. And so, for instance, in this particular presentation, we're going to be discussing a lot about who refugees are. And I'm sure you've heard the news, and we're using refugees to describe asylees, and asylees to describe refugees or migrants. And so the most important part is that a refugee, before they come to the United States, they actually leave their country of origin and seek a refugee status in another country by going through the UNHCR, which means that they actually solicited an entry into the United States with the refugee status. So when they come into the United States, they've already come in with that specific category, which ultimately gives them benefits to different, or it gives them access to different benefits. And the other words, an asylum seeker, it's a very similar term to the one of a refugee, but the difference is that they solicit status within the United States. And so why does all of this matter? Well, it does matter in the sense that, especially when you're doing case management or using your OCAT, it's to determine what is the client eligible for. Also, what kind of other services might this individual be eligible for, given that even though they might have a status, a legal permanent status in the United States, it could differ as to what they can access.
Thank you, Jose. And as we're talking through these different categories of what it means to be an immigrant or a refugee in the United States, I think one of the things that continues to strike me every single day in our work is that there's no one picture that can define who a refugee or who an immigrant is or who an asylum seeker is. And just as diverse and as broad as some of these categories are, and how much brings them together, there are so many different things, from the countries of origin to the cultures, to the unique family experiences, that really mean it's impossible to take a look at one picture and say, this is what it means to serve a refugee or an immigrant family, and here is how to do it well. Next slide, please. So in this, one of the starting points that we really wanted to bring to the table in today's presentation is what it looks like to begin with a strengths-based approach. And this approach is particularly helpful when we're saying, there is no one picture we can look at to say this is the best way to serve this individual family. And the strengths-based approach is an approach that recognizes the unique contributions of each refugee and immigrant family, individual, community, and starts with what they're already bringing to the table. I think when we're talking about populations that we know have experienced extensive trauma and have really difficult histories, it's easy to start with the needs that they're bringing to the table, and to look at what may be lacking. What needs can we step in and help solve? How can we help bring something to the equation that's not already there? But by taking a strengths-based approach, we really step back from that ideology and we look into what it is to look at what they're bringing with them as individuals who have survived through some really horrific experiences. And this helps us also to learn about an individual's resourcefulness and help apply solutions that they already have, which when we think about it at the essence, that's really the starting point for self-sufficiency, is to look at what everybody already has with them and how can we use that to help solve the problems that they're facing. Next slide.
Also, something to add to that, this specific slide is that I'm not sure if you have been aware or have learned about the cultural iceberg model. So the cultural iceberg model, it's a you can just close your eyes and just picture an iceberg, right, in the middle of the ocean. You can only see from the surface a bit of what the iceberg is. Oftentimes you can't see, well, all the time, you can't see what's below it. And so using a cultural iceberg model when assessing clients or just looking at what they have and bring to the table is extremely important, because on the surface, oftentimes, we have certain perceptions of that individual or certain perceptions of the culture, the community, where they come from, how they got here. And the truth is that each individual refugee family or immigrant is very unique. They all have their own story. They might have categories that they are that they fall under the umbrella of, but they have each a unique story, and the reasons why they come to the United States might be very different. Also, their makeup of what they bring and contribute to the table, it's extremely different. So just using that model to keep in mind that when assessing a client and using OCAT, it's to go beyond the category of, oh, this is just another refugee or this is another immigrant, but fully looking at what is it that they bring to the table and what is it that they're asking for, as opposed to what is it that I think they need. Next slide. So similar to the previous slide, taking the approach of trauma-informed care is extremely important when working with refugee and immigrant families. Why? Because it changes the interaction that you have as a caseworker or perhaps as a leader of your team and the actual client and the community that you serve. When you take an approach of trauma and informed care, you're looking beyond the individual's needs. You're looking at what is it that brought them here? What is it that they're encountering? What are their challenges? What are their individual experiences that have brought them where they're at? In addition to that, you start thinking more of a human right. You're humanizing the individual as opposed to just looking at them under a category, and fully assessing what is it that they need. And again, what are their stories that brought them here? Also, it's really important to look at their journey, and the reason why is because when you look at their journey, you're trying to assess what is it that they really need, and are there traumatic experiences and potential health risks that they are facing that ultimately might affect or impact their success, or perhaps the programs that you are implementing or putting them under that they might not actually succeed in because of the different experiences that they've encountered. So taking an approach of trauma and informed care is extremely important, specifically just to making sure that the client is receiving what they need as opposed to what you think they want.
And when it comes to trauma-informed care, there's a specific paradigm that we use in the refugee resettlement world called the triple trauma paradigm. And this paradigm really breaks down the experiences of refugee populations into three different parts: pre-flight, during flight, and post-flight. And the essence of this approach is helping us to realize that traumatic experiences are not isolated to a single component of the refugee experience. It's not isolated to the country of origin that a refugee is fleeing from. It's not only associated with their time of flight in that first country that they flee to, but it's also an experience of trauma in integrating into their new lives in the United States. And when we're working with clients who are trying to access and get integrated into services here in the US, whether that's through the OCAT appraisal tool or in the work that we're doing at, say, a resettlement agency, using this approach in trauma-informed care helps us to be mindful of what our clients may be experiencing here in their integration and adjustment process, and not only think of it as being those experiences that they had overseas or in another country, but that the experience of adjusting to life here can be traumatic in and of itself, or at the very least re-triggering for some of the experiences that have happened. Next slide. So we wanted to highlight a couple of myths and misconceptions about newcomers, and Jose did a great job at delineating some of the differences between some of these words that we can tend to use interchangeably, although they mean very different things. But there are some other myths that we can tend to hear, whether that be in the news media or just in the community, in regards to who are refugees and immigrants, and what is the impact on the United States and having them here. And the first myth that I wanted to address regarding refugees specifically is that the refugee screening process isn't rigorous enough. And we hear this quite often, where we will hear someone make a claim of, we don't know where they're coming from or how they're getting here. And that's simply not true. At the end of the webinar, you'll see there's a link specifically to a former posting on the White House Gov site that shows exactly the process through which a refugee is admitted into the United States. And it's a very extensive process, so much to the point that to come here to the US as a refugee is the hardest way to arrive in the United States. Refugees are vetted more intensively than any other group seeking to enter the US, which includes first being registered by the United Nations Refugee Agency, being hand-selected by the United States for admittance, and going through intense security screenings led by U.S. government authorities, including the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Defense, and multiple security agencies. This process takes anywhere up to around 18 months and is followed by further security checks after refugees arrive in the United States. The second myth is that refugees are a drain on society, that they're just here taking from resources that otherwise could be supporting other members of the United States. Whereas the fact is that 85% of refugees who are resettled by the IRC are working within 180 days of arrival. And that's a feat that we are quite proud of as an agency, and proud of the people that we work with and their ability to kind of hit the ground running upon arrival and start new lives and new jobs within such a short time frame to support their families, and really speaks to the fact that people are coming here seeking to contribute and build new lives.
In addition to that, one of the other myths that's extremely important to address is it is oftentimes thought that immigrants are here illegally. So with so much controversy around this issue of immigrants who are undocumented, it is easy to overlook the fact that most of foreign-born people living in the United States follow the rules and have the permission to be here. Of more than 43 million foreign-born people who were living in the United States in 2014, around 44% were actually naturalized U.S. citizens. Those who were non-naturalized were either lawful permanent residents, also known as green card holders, or immigrants who were unauthorized. And although it is not known exactly what percentage of the 11 million who were originally unauthorized, many of them entered here legally. So they entered with visas, and it's about 40%. And so looking at all these different myths and just having and the different compounding factors that oftentimes frame sort of the scope of how we see immigrants, it is really important to make sure that we do our own assessment of like, what is it that we're bringing already to the table that is framing the families that we work with, or putting them in what kind of category. And so it's important to check ourselves when helping immigrants, and to come with a new perspective every time we engage with a family or individual, given that they all have unique stories, as I mentioned before. Next slide. And so when working with different populations, some of the considerations to look into are family dynamics, emotional health, potential PTSD, so related to trauma, signals of children who are encountering trauma too, just given that they're oftentimes, the assessments are done with the parents and not necessarily with the children, and asking questions about criminal activity. And the reason why all these considerations are extremely important is because oftentimes, given that we work with large numbers of cases, right, we try to use like a cookie cutter model where one model should work for every family that we engage with. And the reality is that each family or individual has its own story, as I mentioned before. So for example, working with a LGBT plus individual or family will be very different than working from someone that came from a very war-torn country, although their experiences of trauma might be very similar, given the fact that they've been persecuted. Their experiences of how they're processing that, or the level of hurt and emotional and psychological damage might be very different. And so assessing all of that is extremely important. Also, one thing is, oftentimes we work with families who have multi-status households. What are those? Multi-status households are where each, again, going back to the first slide we covered, was the categories, right? What kind of category has been assigned to you based on legality reasons? So if you're a green card holder, but you might have U.S. citizen children, you might also have documented children. And so looking at all of that, it's extremely important when assessing the different cases that we work with. In addition to that, also, just looking at when using OCAD, there's certain questions, right, that ultimately will determine how we can better assist the family or individual, and helping them achieve at their fullest potential. And so one of those questions, next slide, is related to criminal activity. And criminal activity, if it's not addressed in a way where it fully assesses the client in a very detailed and a sensitive manner, it can be a traumatic experience. Automatically coming in, are you a criminal? Already it's a very loaded statement, very loaded question. And so if you look at the OCAT, there is a question that asks about, have you ever been convicted of any criminal offense? And so when you ask that question, it could be that our families or individuals might not understand what that means, or they might be afraid of answering a certain way because they might feel like you're not going to approve of their services or are going to judge them. And so oftentimes, given that I've been working in the legal field for a while, it's asking questions like, have you ever been pulled over by the police officer? Or any agent that works for the government, and just questions that dig deeper into their experiences with law enforcement. And the reason why this is extremely important too is because you want to make sure that we're giving them the full service and using everything that they bring to the table and everything that we have, so that we can create pathways that lead to success. And so, for instance, if a family or individual has had issues with law enforcement, that could ultimately deter or create obstacles in accessing resources or putting them in positions where they might not be able to work, or achieve at the potential we perceive that they should be achieving at. So that is extremely important. Also, in immigration law, if you do commit crimes, certain crimes do lead to deportations, and so that could ultimately impact the family, impact their stay here in the United States. Another question, next slide. It's related to questions about mental health. Mental health has often been used in the United States. And I think all over the world, actually. When you ask someone if they have any mental health issues or have problems with self-esteem and whatnot, that's a very sensitive issue, and so oftentimes people don't know how to address that. And specifically in our communities where that's always seen as taboo, almost like crazy, right? And so they're not going to come up and say, yes, I'm struggling with depression, or I'm struggling with trauma. And so when we don't engage the full family, the children, the parents, in ways that they can actually discuss what they're actually feeling, and simply just ask the question, are you encountering mental health issues? We're not really going to address the problems that ultimately will create obstacles for achievement. And so this question can always be asked in ways that are a little bit differently. For example, like, how are you feeling? How do you wake up every morning? Are you excited? Are you sad? Do you miss your family? Do you have lots of friends? Ways where we can fully assess sort of the experiences of the families ultimately will help us better assess what kind of services and what kind of support the families need. Next slide.
So similarly, there's a list of considerations and recommendations that we're going to work through when it comes to working with refugee individuals and families, specifically with the OCAT appraisal tool. And there's a couple of considerations I want to lay the framework for when going through these recommendations. And the first is being mindful of potentially triggering questions. Jose, has covered this pretty well in regards to immigrant populations, and recognizing that some of the questions that we have to ask that are important questions in all of our work can be triggering for past experiences, can be misunderstood, misconstrued, and being mindful in the ways that we ask them Also recognizing that, there are going to be things that we ask and say that we would have no context for potentially being triggering, and maybe to those that we serve. And so we're not always going to know up front what some of these questions may be, but I will try and highlight a couple of them to be mindful of in the appraisal tool in the slides that follow. Another consideration is working within the context of how many of our clients provide information and tell stories. And again, while there is no one picture or framework for understanding refugee populations, a commonality that I often encounter when working with our refugee clients is that many of them come from cultures and backgrounds that have very narrative ways of engaging with information. And oftentimes not very black and white answers to questions. And this can be pretty frustrating when you're working with an appraisal tool that requires you to put yes, no answers, very concrete information to some of these questions, which you may be asking, and instead you're getting a very narrative explanation, not only to that one specific topic area, but an explanation that ties into all of these other barriers that they may be facing. And this is because the barriers faced by refugees don't fit into nice little neat boxes of these are my health needs, these are my employment needs, this is what's impacting my barriers to self-sufficiency over here. They're all interconnected and intertwined into their stories, and we see that in the way that individuals engage with us and talk about their needs and their histories. So a couple of recommendations for working through this process with refugee clients are to really utilize the tools that the OCAT appraisal tool gives you. The first being your ability to jump between those OCAT sections. I have rarely had a successful conversation where I have tried to stay on this one topic area until I'm finished, and instead following that client flow and being able to jump between different sections really helps it to be a more fruitful conversation where I'm able to meet the individual where they're at and engage with what they're telling me instead of trying to follow a linear process. And the other is the use of the notes tool. There's a lot of additional information that is oftentimes shared. You may be asking one question and their answer, has this moment where you think, I think there's something else in this answer that doesn't have to do with the section we're working through right now, but something that we may want to loop back into the future. And so keeping an eye out for questions that prompt follow-up, taking notes from that narrative response in your notes tool, and highlighting anything that may be potential follow-up for future services. Next slide. So one of the particular components of the OCAT appraisal tool that I wanted to highlight is the section where we ask about household compositions and families, and recognizing that defining families is not only a very nuanced question in that a lot of individuals, a lot of cultures, a lot of backgrounds define families differently, but that there can also be a lot of unexpected trauma tied into this question section. With a lot of the diverse cultural backgrounds, even among the same country of origin, and differing stories of transition, there's extended families, there's cultural families, there's individuals who may be considered a part of a household that we may not classically think of that are coming up in these narrative storylines. There's also the potential for walking through who are all the members of your family or the members of your household to trigger a sense of loss, both for family members that are no longer a part of their household because they're left behind, and family members who have passed. And we have seen that come up a lot in talking through family composition and household composition, that this can be sometimes a really triggering experiences about the loss of a sense of family and a sense of home for various reasons. Another thing to note in this slide is that this becomes an especially poignant question when we're talking about how different households oftentimes pull income to meet basic needs. This is something we get a lot of questions about from our refugee clients, and a lot of confusion about how they're defining their household composition, and how when one family member's or household member's employment status changes, how that impacts each unique family member's eligibility. So being mindful that this can raise a lot of questions and confusion for refugee clients as well. Next slide. So the second section of the OCAT appraisal tool that I wanted to highlight is similarly the mental health section. And you'll notice both Jose and I wanted to focus on different components of the mental health section of the appraisal, because this is such an important part of our work, and all of our work when we're engaging with really anybody, but especially when we're dealing and engaging with individuals who have come to the United States seeking safety. And when it comes to some of the specific nuances in engaging around mental health, I wanted to highlight the interconnectedness between health and mental health for many of our clients. And sometimes that this can look like a somatic presentation of emotional distress and mental health needs among refugee clients. And so when you're asking, and we have this appraisal tool that asks questions about, do you feel depressed all of the time? There are very few clients that I have personally been able to work with who would self-identify as being depressed, or meaning some of the terminology that we tend to use in a mental health context. And so recognizing that a lot of our questions about mental health really are embedded in a U.S. context for mental health, and use terminology that many of our clients may not self-identify with. Whereas even in some of the questions are a little more nuanced as far as tired and exhausted. And so being able to recognize when someone may say, nope, I'm never depressed, I'm never fearful, but I'm always tired and exhausted. Or recognizing some of the different ways that an individual may be expressing to you some of their struggles with post-traumatic stress disorder, and responding with having frequent trouble with racing thoughts or rapid breathing, and other experiences that are very rooted in their bodies, but completely disregarding or not wanting to self-identify with anything that has to do with this concept of the mind. Recognizing that for the most part, by nature of being here as a refugee, you have experienced and witnessed incredibly traumatic events. That can also, lead to some interesting implications of the questions of, have you ever experienced or witnessed a frightening or violent event? If you're here as a refugee, the chances are that you have experienced really horrific things as a part of your ability to get here to the United States as a refugee. And that can make questions about violence potentially very triggering, or it can also mean that violence and trauma have been normalized to some extent, and individuals may not identify an event as frightening or violent, even when we would tend to assume that that type of event would certainly fall into that category. They may have a different barometer for what they would say falls into frightening or a violent event. So that just being another way to be mindful of how so many of the questions that we ask related to mental health are really, deeply entrenched in a U.S. context for mental health, and helping us go outside of that box and think about how this may be engaged with by a refugee client. Next slide.
So now that you've you heard Amy and myself speak about just the different ways to approach assessments, specifically when working with refugees, and the OCAT tool that is used through Department of Social Services. Here's a first scenario that was created, and parts of this story are true and some are not. But I'd really like for you to make sure you keep an eye open and a listening ear to ask questions and to think creatively. How would you deal with the situation? So I'm going to read it, and then as I'm reading it, if there are questions, please feel free to put them on the chat box on the right hand side, and then we will assess this case together, and hope that with the conversations that we've been leading with Amy and myself, we are able to better assess this case and just create a new ways to make sure that holistic assessment and care is given to this case. So Hassan, Fatima, and their 4 children, ages 1, 3, and 5, 3, 5, and 6, have an appointment with you, the respective caseworker, at 1 p.m., but show up at 1:30 p.m. You become frustrated because not only are they late, but they did not call to provide an explanation for their late arrival. As soon as they arrive to the DPSS office, you call their name and walk them in. You have them take a seat and reach out with a handshake. Hassan shakes your hand, but Fatima does not. She doesn't even acknowledge you. Not only were you frustrated, but also now feel awkward. You proceed by asking biographical information questions. Hassan keeps answering everything. He even responds to questions made specifically to Fatima. You notice that Fatima continues to look down and not make any eye contact. As you continue with the interview, you ask if there is any criminal history. Hassan responds for both and says no. As you proceed with the questions, Hassan asks to use the restroom and you direct him to the location. At this moment, Fatima takes the opportunity to indicate that she once called the police because of abuse in the household and Hassan was arrested. So how do you respond and address this situation? We'll give you a minute or so to ask those questions, and then our moderator will ask the questions.
Okay, so I have one so far. So how can I suggest speaking to Fatima privately if I am a male caseworker?
That's an excellent question. I think when it comes to dealing with gender roles and just the different cultural backgrounds, it is very important to make sure that we make the client feel comfortable. And so while it's really important to separate both, I think it's important to make sure that in what way will this individual make the women feel comfortable. And so asking another caseworker to come alongside you that's female would be a really great way to separate both individuals and make sure that you continue to further ask questions to investigate the matter of what happened with Fatima, and just again making sure that she feels comfortable. If she doesn't feel comfortable addressing questions to you, then perhaps just having a female provide that care would be very important. Of course, right, in this particular situation, you have a woman who just told you what has happened, and perhaps she is also asking for help in a way where like maybe the abuse is still happening, perhaps there's other things that she's dealing with like trauma or depression based on this or based on other factors. And so separating both individuals is extremely important. I know that at least within our office when we do legal services, even if it's a case that's together, we always separate male and female. And the reason being it's because again, some of these questions are related to domestic abuse, criminal history, even sometimes being married before and not knowing that they've been married before. So there's a lot of information that could be exposed. Of course, that's not saying that all cases are the same, but we do need to provide the care and the space, most important, the space for them to address any issues that they are encountering. So in this particular case, I think addressing it by having a female caseworker alongside of you would be extremely important. And then also just understanding where they're coming from, the background, right? In this case, it starts off with them coming late. Well, it's important to assess like why are they coming late? Do they not have like access to childcare? Do they not have transportation? Where are they coming from? Also, cultural differences, right? Not that one is good or wrong. It's more understanding where they're coming from and the history and just like how time is viewed differently. And so it's all of that. Any other questions?
So there was one that said to ask her about her safety, and then going alongside that, there was another one that said, inquire if Fatima feels safe, and later when Hassan returns, separate the two for the remainder of the interview.
Yeah, and I think it's important to again ask that question. If for example, if the client, if Hassan was coming in and then she's about to answer about her safety, just continue as if nothing had happened, and then ultimately it immediately creates some kind of situation where like, oh well, I need to. This is the moment in time where we actually separate the cases to further ask questions about other things, but not in a way that kind of exposes Fatima, right? Because you also don't want to put her life at risk or just put her in a situation where she feels uncomfortable even more. So doing it in a manner that fully looks at her and respects not only respects her but also kind of empowers her to be strong by saying, hey, we're going to continue, and this is the moment in time where we actually ask individual questions. So Hassan, you're going to meet with me in 10 minutes, and Fatima is going to meet with me for another 10 minutes, and we're going to proceed and kind of move on as if nothing happened, but in a way that is respectful to Fatima.
Great. Thank you. And then we have one more, which says that some aspects of this example are cultural differences, which should be respected, such as a woman not touching a stranger's hand and allowing the man to handle the household business.
And that is yes, and that is really important. Again, when we're engaging with refugee families and immigrants, they all have different backgrounds, right, and different experiences. And so I just making sure that the client feels comfortable, because ultimately we are here to learn from them as they are here to learn from us. And so learning about their culture, if you're able to learn about more of the Islamic culture and religion, or just the Middle Eastern background, South America, and other places where you get most of your clients from, it's so important because not only are you able to fully understand why is it that they act the way they act, but also to dig deeper into questions of understanding struggle and understanding obstacles and understanding need and understanding just who they are as a people. And so yeah, it's definitely do not understanding why is important for a woman to not shake another man's hand is important, and respecting that. Any last questions? Okay, next scenario.
Great. So the second scenario that we have for y'all to consider is a scenario where Ali, his wife Ziba, and 3 children, ages 6 months, 2 years, and 17 years, have an appointment with you. You begin by walking through the OCAT tool with the demographics section, but Ali starts talking immediately about his wife's need for medical services. You acknowledge his concern, but let him know you first want to gather some basic information about them as a family. During the section of employment, Ali insists that Ziba is incapable of working due to her health, speaking on her behalf. He describes her experiences of back pain, constant headaches, and dizziness. You open the notes section to capture some of these concerns and then continue on with the conversation. When Ali brings up Ziba's health concerns again, you pivot the conversation to general health. At this point, Ziba begins answering questions for herself through an interpreter. She relates similar health complaints as those described by her husband, but provides no additional information. You progress to the emotional and mental health section, where Ziba responds a little of the time or none of the time to most questions, stating that she is strong and never depressed or scared. However, in response to feeling worried or nervous and anxious, Ziba states that she feels this way all of the time. When you inquire, she says, I need a job, I don't speak English, we don't have a car. These things are very hard in America, and I am worried all the time. How will my family live? Ali interprets the conversation, restating that Ziba needs to see a doctor for her headaches and back pain, and that she is unable to work. He emphasizes his need for immediate employment to support the family and insists that they can manage on a single income. So there are a lot of different layers to this scenario, and we would love if you take a moment and think about what in the refugee context and background could help you interpret and respond to the different elements of the scenario? What were some triggering questions for potential services? And how could you use questions or motivational interviewing techniques to engage further? Take a moment to type your questions or your thoughts on how you would respond to the scenario into the chat box, and then our moderator will help pose your questions.
So one suggestion is that Ziba might still have undiagnosed issues relating to mental health. It might be because these issues are normalized for her. So even if she doesn't report being depressed or scared, there might be underlying issues there.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation, and definitely something that I would be thinking about in this scenario.
Also, Ali and Ziba may be feeling powerless towards their situation and towards needing assistance.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to consider and look through the different ways that they're both bringing themselves to the table, and some of the differences in how we see that and what that could be indicative of as well.
One question might be a trigger question, I think, is do you think that your health concerns would inhibit you from working?
I love that question. I think there's definitely this assumption here that that Ali is insisting that Ziba is unable to work. We haven't seen Ziba say that for herself, and I think that's something that warrants follow-up, and that I would want to pose as a question back to Ziba is, do you want to work? And if you do want to work, what would you need to make that possible for you? Are your health concerns prohibiting you from engaging in employment? And if so, what would you need for that to be an option for you? If not, is there anything else that's a prohibiting factor? But definitely something that I think warrants triggering questions for additional services.
Mm-hmm. Another person asks, or states rather, share behavioral health and social work services available. Ask clarifying questions about work interests from both parents.
Yeah, and so another thing that has not come up explicitly yet, and maybe be in some of the other comments that I haven't seen, is some of the somatic representation of mental health concerns. And I know the first commenter talks about there may being a kind of like repressed or unacknowledged mental health concerns, but I would be wanting to ask some follow-up questions based on this, and going back to that OCAT appraisal tool screen where it has those questions, and she's saying none of the time in regards to depressed, but she's saying that she feels worried or nervous and anxious all of the time. Those would be the kinds of answers where I would be recognizing she's identifying with the expressions of mental health concerns that exhibit themselves in our physical body. And so what does that mean? How can I use that to launch into additional questions to make sure she's getting access to the care and services that she needs?
Great. Another asker says to use scaling questions. It appears that Ziba is wanting to work regardless of her health.
Great. Yeah.
Just one final. Oh, sorry. Yep. One final one. Inquire if there is a diagnosed disability to determine what type of referral is appropriate if Ziba is interested in working.
Great. That's a fantastic suggestion. All right. Next slide, I think, if there are no more questions.
Okay, this is Patrick again from the OCAT team. So first off, thank you, Amy and Jose, for providing all this fantastic information so far. Our speakers did want to also provide some links for some additional resources. That's in case folks in the webinar want to explore these topics in more detail after our webinar. So the first link is to the International Rescue Committee's homepage. And this website provides some statistics about IRC's work and a lot of information kind of detailing the current state of refugee populations across the US and more broadly worldwide. The second bullet point, these are two resources that kind of explain the screening process for refugee entry into the US. The first is an infographic that provides a kind of a detailed look into step-by-step requirements undergone by every individual who applies for refugee status in the United States. The other is a short video that kind of explains like the whole vetting process for refugees. And while it uses Syrian refugees as an example, all refugees go through the same process, just to clarify. The third resource is a screener for refugee health. And because screening for mental disorders is not a kind of a standard practice for the majority of U.S. refugee resettlement programs, it can be important for caseworkers to understand that refugee clients that they may encounter may have have a number of kind of undiagnosed issues. So this document is comprised of 15 questions that, just to clarify, they don't address violence or torture or trauma, but they are otherwise kind of intended to screen for kind of more common mental disorders that might be associated with things like instances of violence and torture. So these are things like PTSD, anxiety, and depression. So I think it can be useful to view this in order to understand kind of the mental and physical issues that can often be related and how kind of these issues impact one another. And then, kind of similar to how we provided several myths and facts on immigrants and refugee populations, if folks are motivated, they can test their knowledge about newcomers through this quiz, the one that's kind of published by PBS. That's our kind of fourth resource there. And then finally, for those interested in learning about trauma-informed care and how to adapt it into their interactions with clients, this final resource is a toolkit for service organizations and providers to deliver trauma-informed services. Next slide, please. Okay, with that, we're going to go ahead and open up for questions and answers. So again, as you've been doing for the scenarios, go ahead and type in your questions into the question box in the lower right part of the screen, and we'll give folks a minute or so to kind of type in their questions for Amy and Jose. Janetta, I think we might have a question already submitted. Is that right? Janetta, do we have a question that's already been submitted?
Sorry.
Yeah, okay.
I don't. Can you read it off, Patrick? I'm not seeing that one. Oh, here. What are some suggestions for women workers working with male immigrants?
So, given that I've been working, both Amy and I have been working with just distinct populations. If you are female and you're working with a male employee, with a male worker, I think it's just always important to ask questions. And so it seems a little bit weird, right? Because I think we always want to come in with a framework of like we should already know who that client is and where they're coming from. But I think it's okay to make mistakes. And it's not necessarily a mistake, but it's perhaps encountering a challenge that we've never dealt with before and just learning from that experience. I think working with refugees, there's no such thing as mistakes unless you intentionally create a mistake or a problem for them. But I think working with male refugees, I think always just making sure, asking questions of like, where are you coming from? How's your culture like? I think information questions that almost might not be related directly to the OCAT tool, but I think always can be used to fully assess in a deeper way where that family is coming from, or individual, specifically in this case being male, and understanding what their background is. And so just always coming in with a mind of learning, I think it's the best way to start. And then again, there's not one way to engage with a specific culture or community. Even within the same community, individuals act differently. I mean, they're their own individual persona. So just coming from that learning perspective, it's very important.
Yeah, and I would add to that. I love, Jose, your mention on recognizing that even within the same culture, each individual is going to be so uniquely different. As a female staff member working with, at least for our office, predominantly with Afghans, something that I'm always mindful going into it is just to start with the same value system. And that's something I come back to, and I have my staff come back to time and time again, is that oftentimes we may have different representations of the exact same values, but those same values are there to begin with. So there are certain things that you can do that I oftentimes do to be more aware. I usually wait before reaching to shake somebody's hand. My first gesture is to cover my heart and just kind of like do an acknowledgement of someone. And that's my personal choice for showing respect for the fact that a lot of the clients I work with, respect for them looks different than it does in a US culture sometimes. And so that's a personal choice that I oftentimes make, but that's going to differ for each unique individual. And so following the lead of your client, seeing what they're comfortable with, and then tying that back to, okay, how is this an expression of the same values that we hold dear, and bringing that into the conversation. Sometimes I will openly ask that question. Hey, I really want to engage with you in a way that is respectful of you and respectful of me, and this professional relationship that we're in. Please let me know if there are things that I do or that I can do that communicate that respect to you, and I will feel free to do the same as well. So having open communication and acknowledging that is, I think, really the best starting point, given that it's going to be different for each individual.
Great. The next question is, will I always be able to tell when I'm dealing with a client or family who is a refugee?
I would say no. And I guess, of course, that depends on the context in which you're working with someone and the information that you already have about an individual. But the essence of the question of if a refugee walks in the room, do you know it? The answer being no. There's a fantastic poster that I cannot remember who produced it, but we have it on our office wall of hundreds of little Lego men, in men and women in different uniforms and different clothing, and it says on the bottom, "Spot the refugee." And the point being is that you can't. And so knowing that that's not something you're always going to know going into a conversation, I think is in some ways really helpful, because when we come to the heart of what it looks like to engage in trauma-informed and client-centered and mindful ways, it's really about being mindful as a human towards other humans. And so I think there can be challenges, but I think it's also really beautiful in that we don't get to put people in a box because we don't always know ahead of time.
In addition to that, I think also what's interesting is that when we have categories for individuals and the boxes that we place them in, they're all put in place by entities and government agencies. And so even when you work with a diverse group of immigrants, and I'm just including refugees in there, but immigrant populations, oftentimes their stories are very the same, but the category or how they access entering to the United States is very different. And it's not because the undocumented didn't attempt to access it, it's because it was not made available to them. So you can have populations with same background of persecution, but having access to that type of resource or opportunity to enter the United States looks very different. And so you're right, you will not know. And I think that is what's a beautiful thing, and you're reminding yourself at the end of the day that this is just another human being.
Great, thank you. So now we have a really interesting question. So westernized culture sees control as a form of abuse, but this can be misinterpreted by the cultural subservience of the wife in other cultures, especially from the Middle East. In the second scenario, there may have been an assumption of domestic abuse, but this is a touchy subject. How would you approach this?
So so it's a complicated question, I think, given that I think oftentimes, and this could be within the United States, anywhere in the world, there's certain practices or journeys that we've all come from, and perhaps it could be something that was imposed on us, that was left for us. It's maybe not necessarily a traditional thing, but just left to us. And this might not be a valuable thing, but we've kind of used it, whether it be abuse, whether it be control. I mean, there's so many other habits that we have developed over time, or we've just learned as we were children, and we continue to implement that are used to control or abusive people. And I think not so much looking at it as a cultural thing, but again, individually assessing each case, and helping recognize when, despite of where one comes from, that there are practices that if they're inhibiting of another person's freedom, ability to pursue happiness, they're not okay. And so addressing that in a way where that person understands is extremely important, as opposed to like, well, you're just a criminal. And so I think that's why it's such a complex question, because it can't really be a West versus East or a South versus North, because each case has backgrounds and lineage and family and history and a journey and an experience and struggles and challenges and successes. And so it's very complex to say that it's a East versus West, even though there are cultural differences that can perhaps make us think, right? Make us think that it is an East versus a West thing, where and it could be mostly just a practice that they've developed in the community or in the household, because again, they're individual human beings, not necessarily a collective.
And I would add to that also, I think that's a fantastic question, and I think it's something that we encounter all the time. And what I would want to highlight in this is our tendency to want to define something or find an answer to it. And so when there are certain ways of engaging with others, certain ways of presenting, it can raise this question, or as the question poser was noting, people can make assumptions. Is there abuse going on there? Well, the question that I like to pose back or have us to consider is, when it is or isn't our job to define something, and instead make sure that we're providing equal access to information and to resources, and supporting a client in their choices about how they want to engage with those services and those resources. And so when we kind of take a step back from needing to be the person defining whether or not there is some type of abuse happening in a relationship, instead saying, these are the resources, these are the information. We're going to make sure that all parties have equal access to services, have equal access to information on their rights, equal access to what services are available, and then we're going to support them in their choices and how they want to engage or not engage with those services. And I think that's a really helpful starting point from bringing us back from that point of trying to kind of investigate or dissect or see what may be happening in a situation, and instead saying, here's how we're going to be supportive in providing all of the options that are available, and making sure everyone has access to that.
Great. I think we have one more question right now, which is, are there any additional trainings available or resources on how to improve culturally appropriate communication with immigrants and refugees?
The first thing that I would suggest is getting in contact with your local resettlement agencies wherever you're located in. I know that oftentimes staff here from our IRC office here in Sacramento, we provide cultural competency trainings on an ongoing basis, both to community organizations as well as other service providers about working specifically with the populations we resettle. We have many of our staff who come from those cultures of origin who provide those trainings. And so that would be a resource that I would reach out to. Look to the organizations in your areas that are specifically serving those populations and see if they have the ability or the capacity to send some staff to provide that training.
In addition to that, I think something that's extremely important, and we used this model with World Relief Southern California, is just engaging with families through whether it be like festivals or dinners or just community events. That is where a lot of the learning takes place. When you walk alongside families, individuals from different backgrounds, that they themselves would teach you. I think you can only learn so much from a book, and so when you do both the understanding and the education and learning through whether it be webinars or books or any other types of educational material, that's half of the success. The rest comes from actually engaging and spending time with the family so that they can teach you and guide you and help you better understand where they come from. I think would be really important, and I think it's very transformational. For both, right? As you're both teaching each other, guiding each other, educating each other about who you are, where you come from, and what your background is. And so I encourage you to do that and to find areas or locations where families meet, whether it be through festivals once again, or any other community organized events.
Okay, with that, we'll go ahead and conclude our webinar. Thank you, first off, so much to Amy and Jose for, again, all the information they provided. That was a fantastic presentation. And thanks everybody who joined the webinar for taking the time to listen in and to participate. Just a quick comment. I know people always want to know about this question, and that yes, the slides will be available. The webinar slides, the recording, question and answer transcripts, and a little quiz to test your knowledge on this topic will all be available on the OCAT Learning Center. And again, if you have any questions about how to access the Learning Center, it's on your OCAT dashboard. And again, if you can't find that, go ahead and reach out to the help desk and we'll point you in the right direction. And with that, if you could just hang on for a really quick evaluation, it's a one-question evaluation. We would very much appreciate your feedback. So go ahead and bring that poll up. Ta-da. Okay. So once again, thanks so much, everybody. Much appreciated.